Hey guys, and welcome to another video. And as promised, today we are going to be looking at this Tseng Labs video card from 1983. Now, I got this from a subscriber. Thank you very much, by the way. And as you can see, there was quite a lot of battery corrosion damage here on these chips. So the card needs a lot of cleanup, and we will need to check if all of the traces are still okay and if all of these components are still working. So there's this white residue all over the place, and as you can see, the pins are very corroded there on the top. Now, spoiler alert, we will not be able to fix this video card in this video, so this will be a multi-part series. Hopefully there won't be too many parts in order to get this up and running. And I very much appreciate anybody getting in touch with me to help me get this video card up and running again, as some of you have already done. Part 2 of this video should drop in a couple of days. I have done all of the footage, I just need to edit everything. So yeah, hope you guys stick around. Now we can try and clean as much as we can using some vinegar. So here I'm just scrubbing along the pins to try to neutralize the battery acid that got stuck on the pins here. But I mean, it does clean it off somewhat, but still not 100% perfect. And we still don't know what the effect has been on the traces underneath the chips. So that's also something that we will need to take a look at. Now, most of the chips are soldered on the PCB. There are some socketed chips like this EEPROM here. And as you can see, as we remove it from its socket, you will see that the actual socket itself is also pretty much corroded. The chip itself doesn't look half bad. I will also be cleaning it up a little bit, but it's primarily the socket and the connectors in the socket that require some cleanup here. So again, we're going to be using some white vinegar to clean these contacts. I'm also going to be adding some contact cleaner into them just to make sure that all of the connections are still valid. So I then cleaned everything using isopropyl alcohol just to get rid of all the vinegar. I let it dry for a little bit, and then I tried the video card in a PC, and this is what I got. One long beep followed by 2 beeps indicates an issue with the video card, so that's pretty obvious. So let's continue with our diagnostics. Now, I noticed that there were 3 tantalum capacitors here on the power rails, and these are 10 microfarad 16 volt tantalum capacitors. There are 3 of them. Now, these have a tendency to explode, so I am going to be testing them. I have my ESR meter here, and although this claims to be able to do in-circuit testing, I have found these results to be very inaccurate. And in fact, you do need to remove the capacitors out of circuits to do a proper measurements, because for example here you can see that it's unable to measure the capacitance, and also the ESR reading is a bit off, as we will see later on. So I'm going to be applying some solder here to the legs of the capacitor, and then we can just wiggle it out and it should drop right off the PCB. So I've done that with all 3 of them. And as you can see here, we have a 10 microfarad 16 volt capacitor. It is polarized, so we notice the little plus signs which indicate the positive side of the capacitor. These are sitting on the power rail, so it's very important to get the orientation right. But now that we've got them off the PCB, let's test them again using the ESR meter. And now we can always measure capacitance. And as you can see, the ESR reading has gone up quite considerably. So it's already at 0.9 ohms, whereas in circuits some capacitors read 0.2 ohms and others read 2 ohms. So it's always better to get them out of the circuit. So here I have a brand new tantalum capacitor, again 10 microfarad, although this one is 35 volts, but that doesn't really matter. As long as the voltage is higher, then it's good. And this one has an ESR of about 0.5 ohms. So let's clean the through holes here where we removed the capacitors so that we have enough space to put the new capacitors in. So if it doesn't really work on the front of the PCB, sometimes you need to do it on the back of the PCB just to clear the holes better. And then notice on the PCB silk screen we have the plus sign here. Again, as I said, these are capacitors that sit on the power rails, so the orientation of the capacitor is very important, so we need to take into account the plus sign of the capacitor and make sure that it corresponds to the plus sign on the silk screen of the PCB. So we need to do that for the 3 capacitors that we removed. And so here we have it. We have the first one here, second one, and third. So now we can go ahead and apply some flux here and then solder the capacitors onto the PCB like so. And then we just clip the excess leads off of the components and then we should be good to go. But as I already suspected, this didn't really do a whole lot. We still get the beeps when turning on the computer, so this was just a thing that I did as a precaution just to make sure that these capacitors wouldn't blow up in my face. Now, where there is battery leakage and you have a pileup of corrosion, it can have an impact on the traces. Like for example here, just on the left of the C20, you see that the trace is somewhat damaged. I mean, you can clearly see an interrupt in the green line. And as we follow that trace here on the PCB, you might think that it just goes underneath this IC chip here. But I've already gone and desoldered this one. So if I remove the chip, you can see that, you know, the trace, what we thought initially was just, you know, going straight underneath the PCB, isn't going underneath the PCB at all in one straight line. It actually goes upward here, and then we have another trace starting there. So that means that you can't just make assumptions where certain traces are going on the PCB. You actually need to verify them, because imagine that we were thinking that this was a straight line underneath the IC. We would obviously see that the trace would not complete. So we might think that the trace was broken, and due to the interrupt that we see there on the left of the C20, we might end up fixing a trace which isn't even a trace, causing potential damage to the components and not fixing anything at all. So it's very important to verify all of the traces. Now, a first mistake that you can make when trying to remove ICs from the PCB is just trying to heat up the pads like this without adding any additional solder. So it might sound a little bit counterintuitive to add solder when you try to remove solder, to remove a component, but it actually does help. For example, here I'm not adding any solder, I'm just trying to suck the existing solder away by heating up the pad. And although it does work somewhat, as you can see, it's not really clearing up the through holes as much as it should, and you will have issues removing this component. The pins will not be completely freed. And in the name of science, just to show you guys what will happen if you try to remove the IC in this way, there is a lot of friction and you will not be able to remove the component from the PCB without damaging it. There were 2 legs that got stuck on the PCB and the chip was effectively broken. So here you can see the 2 legs that got stuck, and yeah, underneath here obviously a lot of damage happened to the chip. Now I do have spare chips for that. I'll be going over those in a bit, but this was just to show you how not to do it. Now a better way to do it before desoldering it is to apply some flux to the pins of the IC that you want to remove. Add some additional solder. And then when trying to remove the excess solder using your solder sucker, you will see that it becomes a lot easier to free up the through hole than it was before. So because we added some additional solder, it got mixed with the existing solder. You got a bigger mass of solder that you were able to heat up, and sucking that solder away became a lot easier. Now, if there are still some pins which are stuck, just add some solder again to them and use your solder sucker to get the excess solder out of there, like I'm doing here. And this should free up the pin completely. You can always verify that with a screwdriver just to see if the pin has been completely freed. Now, when you try to remove the IC like this, you will still see that there's a lot of friction and it doesn't want to go off the PCB just like that. And that's because on the top of the PCB, where the pins touch the PCB, there is still some excess solder that we couldn't suck from the bottom. Now you can use some solder wick to get rid of that excess solder on the top of the PCB. And you will need to do that on both sides of the IC. But yeah, from my experience, although it is a little bit better, and after some time you will be able to get rid of some excess solder, it will still be very difficult to remove the IC from the PCB like this. Especially on old circuit boards like this, where there is perhaps some corrosion, it is again very easy to snap off a certain part of the chip in attempting to remove them. And this is again what happened here. Although it was a little bit easier to get the chip off, it still got damaged, and there has to be a better way to do it. And that better way involves using this little bad boy here, the heat gun. This will make your life so much easier in terms of removing ICs from PCBs. So let me show you how. So by applying the heat gun to the bottom of the PCB and warming up the pins here, so you just try to get as much hot air on there evenly as possible just by moving it around. Don't try to hold it at one specific place for too long. Just move it around a little bit on the different pins. And after a while you will start to feel that the chip is starting to get loose, starting to lift off from the PCB, and then it should go relatively fast. It will kind of snap off the PCB on one end, and usually you can just take it out on the other side as well. So I'm just going to be taking my screwdriver here, and with very little effort I am able to remove the chip from the PCB without damaging it. So there is no damage to the chip itself. The legs are intact, the housing is intact. And because we initially used the solder sucker to free up the pins here, the through holes are very much cleared up. Now when removing a chip, obviously there will be some debris beneath it, so it's obviously always a good idea to use some isopropyl alcohol to clean it. And this gives you a very good idea on what's happening underneath the chip. So here you can see I've already removed a bunch of ICs and replaced them with IC sockets. And the reason I did that is because, let me give you another example here. So we see these two traces here between the IC on the left and the EEPROM socket on the right. And it is very difficult to know where the traces are going, because underneath this EEPROM socket a lot of stuff is going on as well. And if we remove this IC from its socket, we can already see what is happening here underneath this chip. But for the EEPROM it's a different story, because there obviously the socket is not transparent. So I went ahead and desoldered it, and as you can see here there are lots of points here beneath the chip, and what again you might think is a trace that goes straight through the EEPROM chip here is not the case. It ends somewhere in the middle and then it starts to branch off again. So again, to make sure that you're not making any assumptions on where certain traces are going, sometimes it is necessary to remove components. Now with the components removed, you get a very nice view of all of the traces, especially on the top of the PCB here, where you get the option now to go and test all of these connections, because they are no longer hiding underneath ICs anymore. They are completely freed up, they are completely visible, and it makes debugging traces a lot easier. Now what I tend to do is I like to take a picture of the PCB so that I have some point of reference, because at some points we will be adding components again to this PCB, and then you obviously don't want to be desoldering stuff all of the time, and you want to get some idea on how the PCB looked like without of the components. Because it's one thing to test everything now without the components inserted. It is possible that for example, an IC socket that hasn't been soldered on correctly, or a chip in an IC socket which is making bad contact, will make your video card not work, despite the fact that the traces might be okay. But while we're on the subject of these IC sockets, I will be mounting them on the PCB so that I can freely swap components, ICs in and out a lot more easy. Now, while soldering these IC sockets onto the PCB, you need to make sure that they are put in very firmly on the PCB. So because there are other components on the PCB which are higher than the IC sockets that we are going to be adding here, I just place something underneath the PCB just to apply some pressure to the IC socket and make sure that it makes a firm connection on the PCB. And what we also need to check is to see if, again, all of the traces are working correctly before we start adding these sockets. For example, here, because I kind of ripped off the IC from the PCB, some of the pad here got damaged, and the trace here that should normally hit this pin and should connect up to this pin here below isn't making a connection anymore. And this was one of the 3 traces that I needed to fix on this PCB. So yeah, you can clearly see here that the pad is no longer making any contact with the trace, and as soon as we would put an IC socket in here, there's no way that the chip would make contact. Now, when the components are removed, you get the best possible view of all of the traces. And it's very important to test all of these traces, even after you've added the components, just to make sure that all of the contacts are working. So here you can see an area where I took a picture when a lot of the ICs were removed. And what I did was I followed all of the kind of the top level traces on top of the PCB, and I marked every through hole where I saw a trace leaving or arriving, and I checked the continuity between 2 points, and then I marked them as soon as I found continuity. So that gives me sufficient confidence that that trace is working, especially on this area here. And it's just a matter of following all of these traces. And just because I had a picture here without the ICs, it was very easy for me to follow all of the paths. Something which is no longer possible when you have added the components again on the PCB. So, what can we conclude so far? Well, so far there are 3 traces on the PCB that have been broken. So let's take a look at this one here, which goes all the way to pin number 3 here on the right. Should make contact with this pad, and it doesn't. Second trace on the bottom here goes to the 3rd pin here. Nothing. And finally, these 2 pins here opposite each other on the 2 ICs, nothing. So we'll need to go ahead and patch those. So I've prepared some patch wires here, so I'm just going to make the connections here at the back of the PCB. And then we can check the connections again to see if the fixes are okay. It's always best to double check to see if the connections are properly made, because it's a bit counterintuitive to look at a picture and then make the connections from the back side of the PCB, because everything is turned upside down, obviously. So let's go and verify if we've made any progress. So let's check this connection right here from the bottom to the 3rd pin. Let's check this connection here. Okay. And then the final connection. So this is also good. Now, at the heart of this display controller lies the 6845 display controller from Motorola, but what's more important in terms of reliability is perhaps these RAM chips here. Now, RAM chips in most PC systems are likely candidates to go bad. So because we also have a lot of corrosion here and there's a lot of gunk here underneath these chips, I am going to be removing all of the RAM chips here, and I am going to be cleaning them up so that we can get a good view on the traces underneath the RAM chips, just to make sure that they aren't damaged. I'm going to do that for all of the RAM chips. So we can check some of the connections here just to make sure that everything is okay. Because I want to experiment with different RAM chips, I'm going to be adding these IC sockets here so that I don't need to plug in the RAM chips directly. So I'm just going to be holding them down with a piece of tape so that they don't fall down when I solder them onto the PCB. We always need to make sure that all of the pins of the IC sockets are going through the PCB, and then we can attach them. We can check some of the connections again. And then finally add a new set of RAM chips that I know work, so that we are absolutely sure that there isn't an issue with the video memory. So let's see what she does with all of these changes made, and we get exactly the same. And I'm getting pretty tired of hearing these little beeps here. But I'm not one to quit all that easy, so in part 2 of this video we're going to be looking at some logic chips to act as replacement chips. We'll pull some of the chips off of the video card and do some tests in isolation. Look at some of the circuitry on the video card in more detail, like this clock circuit here. Some more breadboarding. And hopefully make some progress. Or not. So, hope you guys stick around for part 2 of this video. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you guys soon. Bye bye.